So this painting is based on a photo I took in the countryside in the Netherlands when I went to visit my parents last year, and I really liked the strong composition here of the waterway that converges in the distance, so a strong single point perspective. There's a dramatic sky, it's late in the afternoon, there's a bit of glow from the sunset, so we can use a lot of wet and wet for those clouds, and then the classic Dutch landscape that's really flat and we can see very far in the distance. So I hope you enjoyed this painting. Let's get started. I'll skip the drawing part. You can't really see it on the video, but it's obviously very simple. A couple of lines for the horizon, which is not quite at the halfway mark, so it's just below the halfway point of the page. And then the river or waterway that vanishes into the distance. I start with wetting the page, which I usually do when I have a wet in wet sky. And so that it's not totally dripping or have puddles of water on my page, I use a little sponge just to even out the water. I'm going for a sunset mood, so there is a subtle golden glow in the sky. So I'm starting with raw sienna, which is my go-to base color for a lot of the skies that I paint. It's lovely transparent, it's warm, it's got a glow to it, and it doesn't turn to green when I mix it with the blue. As you can see here, it actually turns more into a grey color when I add cerulean blue into it, and because it's late in the day, the mood of the painting is a little bit, darker, a bit more muted. So I'm not going to come in with a bright blue sky, but I'm trying to mix a warmish grey. There's a cloud cover over the sky that the sun reflects into. So I'm using cerulean blue, bit of burnt sienna and a bit of cobalt blue. Again, this is one of those things, you just got to feel your way into those colors, use what you like. These are my preference of pigments to use for these kind of mixes, and that comes with practice and experience. And you can see I'm going into that palette quite a few times, and I don't mix a large puddle of it. I probably don't need that much because the paper is still quite wet, so the pigment will spread out a lot. And I'm also going to go in with a darker color over the top to add a bit more depth to those clouds. But before I do that, I'm going to fill in those white caps with a lighter color. And it's also a little bit cooler, so I've used a bit of lavender and some quinacridone rose to have a sort of a purplish grey, a pinkish grey, I suppose, to describe that color, and fill in the gaps between those darker clouds. And as you've noticed with the raw sienna mix, I'm painting straight through the whole page into where the water is, and try and mirror what's above the horizon line so that there is some symmetry between the sky and a reflection of the sky. That approach works anytime you are painting a still body of water like a lake, or in this instance a waterway that doesn't flow with a lot of ripples in it. You just paint the reflection at the same time and then add the landmass in later on, as you will see in a couple of minutes. Now I've been busy mixing a bit of a darker grey with a bit more blue and a bit of indigo and a bit of neutral tint, just to get a bit more value into the cloud mix, because I want to make sure that I have enough variation in those clouds. So the three different shades, I guess, of grey. So there's a darker one, then the mid-tone that we started with, and that lighter pinkish grey. And before I finish with the sky, I'm just going to add a very subtle layer of clouds on the horizon, just above the horizon line. I'm going to strengthen some of the darker clouds a little bit, because as it dries I can see that it's getting lighter and lighter because I've started with so much water, and I'm just going to keep adding to it before it all dries up. And that'll be the last thing I do on the sky, and I've let that completely dry, and now I'm mixing the green color that's going to go in the foreground and the midground. I'm speeding this up a little bit, and I think you can still see what I'm doing. And as always, when I have a large area to cover with the same color, say a green, I'll try and vary that green as much as I can just by adding, a little bit warmth to it, or a bit of coolness to it, adding more blue, adding a bit more yellow to it. But here I'm first just blocking out the shape because I want it to be quite precise with the shoreline. There's some subtle indents so that it's not just two straight lines and it looks like a pyramid. So I had to be careful, but you can see I'm adding a little bit more of the gold color towards the horizon where the sunlight is sort of touching the far distance of that field. And then equally I'm going to mix a darker version of the green to drop that in just on the waterline there, just to give it a bit of depth. That's not flat, obviously. It's quite long grass, could be a cornfield or something like that. I can't remember what it actually is, but has a bit of depth to it. And the same on the right side, making it a bit thicker, that dark line, because we can see more of that and it's a bit closer to us than the left side. And I've made a bit of a jump there, but you can see that I've just continued with that dark color to create that edge on the shoreline. And then I'm also going to darken the foreground because, again, the light is all the way in the distance on the horizon. So as it comes closer to the viewer, to the camera, if you will, it gets darker, the light's lost. Now I've moved on to the tree line in the far distance, and that is sort of a blue-greyish color because it's in the far distance, so there is some atmospheric perspective going on now. We've lost some of the color. It's also against the light, so it's a silhouette, so we can't really see the colors of those trees. So that's just a kind of a bluish grey that I'm using for that. And when we paint tree lines like that, it's very important to be mindful that it's has a lot of variation in it, so we don't paint the same tree over and over and it's a consistent line or a zigzag line, or it's got to be interesting to the eye, so we've got to bring in as much variation. Our brains always want to paint very consistent and the same sort of shapes, but I'm okay with what I've created in the background, and now I'm going to mirror that as a reflection in the water. And we can only sort of see the top of the trees because there's obviously quite a bit of distance between the horizon line and the reflection in the water. I'm probably cheated a little bit. It's not quite what it looks like in reality, but good enough to get away with it and just to give that illusion of reflection, which will make it look more like water as well. Because we have to create the illusion that this is a still body of water, almost glassy surface, and the sky and the trees are reflected in it. There's no ripples in the water. Now I'm zooming in because I like to add a few birds flying around. That automatically creates life and a bit of movement in the painting. Also something to look at, a bit of a storyline, where the bird's going, where they're coming from, are they migrating, are they passing by. And I decided to add a couple more off to the left side that aren't reflected, because otherwise it was too much going on right in the middle of the painting with the water, off to the distance there and the focal point, and then the birds. So I sort of had to create a bit of a distraction. And now I'm just going to add just a couple of horizontal lines to give the water a tiny bit of movement, some ripples made by the wind, and then I'm adding a few white gouache splatters. Again, something I do in most paintings. It just creates a bit of texture, something to break up the monotony of a particular large shape of the same color. And I didn't like that big gap there, so I decided to add a few more trees that keeps the eye traveling along that horizon line. It's time to rip off the masking tape and have a look at the finished painting. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy this composition and you'll try it for yourself. And let me know in the comments what you think. And yeah, keen to see your work.